In terms of this, what we see in people with borderline personality disorder is that they engage in behaviors to try to keep people close to them. But ironically, these kinds of behaviors often push people away. So in the case of Miss Arias, this was demonstrated throughout her relationship, well, throughout life, and also with Mr. Alexander. For example, after they broke up, when they broke off their relationship, she then moved to Mesa to be closer to him. I also interviewed his brother, Steve, and he indicated to me that Mr. Alexander...
Without telling us what he said, what characteristic did you find?
This fear of abandonment. This tendency to overstep boundaries, to be intrusive. Miss Arias herself notified me that she had checked his Facebook without his permission, read text messages without his permission, engaging in these kinds of behaviors of, don't leave me, let me see what you're doing, I want you to be near me. There was indication from friends that highlighted her tendency to engage in these intrusive behaviors by spying on him, by being intrusive with his space in general.
Okay, and so did she meet this characteristic or this criteria? What is the, you need to take a look at the exhibit, what's the second criteria?
Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships.
What are we talking about there?
People with borderline personality disorder have a very difficult time maintaining what we would consider healthy interpersonal relationships. What they do is they have this tendency to split people, meaning that they have a tendency to either idealize them on one hand or devalue them and despise them. And what I mean by that, idealize means that they put this person up on a pedestal and nothing that they do, no matter what, they view them as being perfect. Whereas devalue and despise, no matter what they do, they dislike them, they're upset with them. And what we see with individuals with borderline personality disorder is that they tend to shift between these two types of interacting with people.
So give us some examples, if there are any, involving the defendant.
I did find that Ms. Arias met the symptom for borderline personality disorder. She had a very strong tendency to go from boyfriend to boyfriend, one after another, which is also another example of fear of abandonment that I just highlighted. What I found is in these relationships, there was a very strong tendency to idealize the men that she was with. For example, she had indicated to me that Mr. Alexander was not faithful to her during the relationship, but nonetheless, she still had this devout love for him. And you can see even within her journals, the way that she talks about her boyfriends and her partners in general.
All right.
And you can see even within her journals, the way that she talks about her boyfriends and her partners in general. It has this very adolescent, immature, for lack of a better word, a saccharine kind of feel to it, a very strong, sweet, wanting to make them happy feel to it, doing anything possible, keeping them idealized despite what was going on in their relationship.
How about the next characteristic?
The next characteristic is identity disturbance.
What is that?
Again, I'd like to relate back to thinking of a teenager. When we're young, we all develop a sense of who we are as a person, and that can shift when we're younger. That can shift in many different ways. But what we find as we grow through adulthood, that becomes much more stable. We have a good sense of who we are as a person, what our beliefs are, how we engage with the world. It becomes relatively consistent. You have an idea of who you are. What we see in people with borderline personality disorder is that sense of identity is not there. It's not stable. It's changing. It tends to change depending on who's in their environment. And this is also a symptom that I found in Miss Arias. You can see this in her tendency to join the Mormon Church really quickly. You can also see this in the records when her ex-boyfriend Daryl was talking about her pattern of behaviors. He had indicated that at one point she
Overruled. You may continue.
He had indicated that there was a point in which she had changed the color of her hair, bought a certain car, and acted a certain way to be consistent with his ex-wife. Again, this tendency to shift who she is. She had indicated to me that when she was with one boyfriend, she behaved one way, whereas with other boyfriends, she behaved a very different way, lived a very different lifestyle.
Give me an example of that.
For example, with her boyfriend Matt, she had indicated that at one point they were living in a tent, versus when she was with Daryl, she attempted to be much more mature when she was around Daryl and professional when she was around Mr. Alexander. It's this constant shifting in who she is dependent on who's in her environment.
And how about the next characteristic?
Impulsivity.
What does that refer to?
The tendency to do things on a whim, to not be thoughtful about your actions and be impulsive. This is not a symptom characteristic that I found to be a stable characteristic in Miss Arias.
So in other words, this is not something that you found as part, on her part then?
Right, I do not believe she meets this symptom.
All right, how about the next one?
Suicidal behavior.
Did you say pseudo?
Suicidal
Oh, suicidal.
behavior and ideation.
I think that's self-explanatory. Tell us whether or not the defendant had any suicidal behavior and whether or not she had any ideation about that.
It's self-explanatory in some ways, in other ways it's not. You can see suicidal behavior in a number of different psychological disorders. The way in which it fits into the pattern that we see with borderline personality disorder is that, again, you're looking for a consistent pattern throughout life. I fortunately had access to Miss Arias's diary, and throughout her diary, beginning in 1995, there was consistent notations about the desire to not be alive, to engage in suicidal behavior, thoughts about it.
And so did she meet?
All right, that is Janeen DeMarte, the rebuttal witness for the prosecution.
What's the next criteria?
It's called affective instability.
What is it, affective?
Affective instability.
And I did not hear the next words.
Instability.
Okay. What is this referring to?
The easiest way to think about this symptom is a roller coaster of emotions. Affective instability is when your emotions go up and down at a very quick pace, unpredictably up and down. And this is often referred to when people show the symptom. Most people will refer to it as the person has bipolar disorder, which is not an accurate representation of what bipolar disorder actually is, but it's just a quick shifting of emotions.
And does she meet this?
Yes, there was consistent evidence in the records of her tendency to go up and down. Several of her boyfriends described her, in fact, all of them, of the information that I have had access to, they all described her as having very quick shifting emotions, going from happy to mad to sad very quickly. And interestingly, I saw that myself within her journal entries. Within the same day, I could see a person who was very happy to shifting to be very upset, very sad, and within one day, very quickly.
Anything else under this section? Not this section, but the one involving the characteristics. Anything else?
Well, one more thing related to affective instability, again, because I am looking for a pattern of symptoms over time. There was indication that her parents had described this as being a consistent behavior for her since she was relatively young.
All right, next.
Chronic feelings of emptiness.
I'm sorry?
Feelings of emptiness.
And how many of these characteristics are laid out in the DSM-4?
How many symptoms?
Symptoms.
There's 9 symptoms.
And of the 9, how many must be met before this diagnosis is viable?
5.
Okay? Feelings of emptiness. Tell me about that.
We find that people who have borderline personality disorder tend to have this prolonged sense of just feeling empty, just feeling like there's nothing there, despite the fact that there's all this emotional turmoil that does go on inside. They have this sense of just being empty. And I specifically asked Ms. Arias about that, who indicated that she's felt that way since adolescence, just this sense of emptiness.
Next, symptoms.
Inappropriate, intense anger.
Okay. What is that?
It's a tendency to engage in angry and aggressive behaviors. Again, we're looking for patterns of behavior.
And did you find anything in her writings where she admitted that she had this inappropriate, intense anger?
Yes, she identified it in an email to Mr. Alexander.
I'm going to show you an exhibit. Take a look at Exhibit 623, see if you recognize it.
Yes,
And what's the date of that email?
it's February 14th, 2007.
And who is it from?
It's from Ms. Arias,
To whom?
Mr. Alexander.
And does it discuss her inappropriate, intense anger?
It does.
May continue.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. You indicated there was 9, I think, symptoms that indicated or that may be explored when deciding whether or not something is borderline personality disorder.
That's correct.
And what's the 9th one?
Transient, stress-related paranoid ideation.
Transient, stress-related.
Paranoid ideation.
What is that?
What that means is in times of extreme stress, we see high levels of paranoia.
And did you find this in this particular case?
No.
If we could just wait for the... You agree or disagree with Dr. Samuels that the defendant may be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder?
I disagree with that diagnosis.
Tell me why you disagree with that.
There wasn't symptoms that were consistent with that diagnosis.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
There were not symptoms that Ms. Arias displayed that would be consistent with that diagnosis.
All right, let's wait for that.
I'd also like to clarify another.
No, there's no question. Does it relate to what you have in front of you involving borderline personality disorder?
Yes.
Let me take a look at it. Which section are you referring to?
Referring to symptom number 2. I'd like to offer an example.
Pardon?
I'd like to offer an example so the court is more clear.
Okay, well, let's get things straight in court. Let's bring in our great criminal defense attorney, Joey Jackson. Let's take on Janeen DeMarte, and let's go big picture here. I thought the highlight, at least for the prosecution, was when they're talking about Jody Arias, aggressive, hostile, seething. I mean, yes, she can take apart the experts, but going after Jody Arias is where she really gets it done for the prosecutor.
Absolutely. Look, I like what she's doing because what she's doing is she's taking facts and she's putting them right next to the criteria. Case in point, when she talks about Jody almost being a chameleon, but then she justifies her conclusions with specific facts. Like what? Like the changing of her hair color, like getting into the Mormon religion, like being mature or less mature depending upon who she's around. So that's a very effective technique, because what it's doing is it's saying this is the criteria and these are the facts that comport with the criteria, something that's very important, and that establishes her credibility.
Okay. This is going well for Juan Martinez, right? I mean, he's not obviously yelling at her. It's his witness, and we've even seen him yell at his own witnesses. But and it's methodical. It's point by point. On the other side, do you see any openings for the defense? Because they're going to have to attack her at some point.
There's always going to be openings for the defense, and the defense is going to cross-examine her, of course, to establish that, listen, you drew these conclusions. Is that correct? And you analyze